Hello, and welcome to Required Reading, the podcast that revisits the most impactful books from our childhood. I'm your host, Erin Bowles. I am a writer, actor, and comedian. And our guest today is returning wonderful guest, Jess Woodworth. This is your third episode. You did Tale of Despero, you did Nightmare Before Christmas, when I needed a quick little filler episode for Halloween. Hello, and welcome back.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be back.
Our book today, you messaged me that you got a new nice copy of this book and wanted to talk about it, and I had never read it before.
hmm
So I felt like perfect. I love when people come to me for books because it means I don't have to do the work and I get to discover something exciting.
Yeah,
And this week, returning author Stephenie Meyer, the host from, I believe, 2008.
that sounds right. Yeah.
What is your, well, actually, first, let's say, what is this book? How would you describe this book?
It's like
For those
body
unfamiliar.
snatcher horror mixed with love triangle slash square romance. And it focuses on the end of the world. The world is like 90% conquered, to at least our understanding, by this like alien life form. And so we get to go through the lens of what it's like to not only be assimilated, but also to reject that assimilation. And we get to see these two sides inside of our main protagonist.
Yeah. The world has been conquered by aliens that when they're not in, they're described as parasites. They have to be
Mhm.
implanted in another species to survive, which is interesting and
Yeah, they
a
have like
point I want to come back
1,000
to.
tendrils.
Yes, they're like extremely leggy silver centipedes
Yeah.
when they're like
Iridescent
out of
almost.
body.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
like
it also makes
I
their
was sort of
eyes iridescent.
yes.
Yeah.
So 90, like you said, like 90% of humans have this thing in it, and it makes humans like adopt the traits of these guys, which is like very peaceful,
hmm
it's very trusting, which means they don't need money, and it's all sort of
It's
very
basically kind of like a socialist society,
yeah.
kind of.
They never say it, but it's like very civilized is the idea
Yes.
behind it.
Yeah.
Like we're putting down violence and we're putting down like there's a maybe I already said this. There's a line where they're like, we don't need money because everyone's truthful, which I
Yeah.
thought was so interesting
Yeah. The reason
that
that we
those are
make
the
sure that
ideas.
we
Yeah.
like even do inventory is just so that we can keep up with inventory. There's no money involved.
Right.
Also, I know there's a couple lines that go into like this species doesn't have a word for lie. This species doesn't have a
Right.
word for dishonest. This species doesn't have a word for war because they don't even have a like concept of what that is, even though they're causing those things. Like they don't
Right.
have any concept of like evil, quote unquote.
Right. And so the actual focus of the book is our main character is one of these aliens they're referred to as souls who is implanted in like a 20-year-old woman
Yeah.
who was still human,
Yes.
obviously. And she ends up spending most of the book with her sort of like the host title of the book, the
Roll
host's
credit.
like freedom fighter secret human cell and like
Exactly.
trying to convince them that she's a good person and sort of it's less about like what makes a human maybe I don't know it's a very interesting book if this is a long one this is a long book
It's long. It's
this
long.
is a long
It's 600 pages, a little over 600 pages, but it's long and it's
right
has tiny writing. It's a chunky one.
so
um,
how did this
I,
book come into your life? Yeah.
so
No, go for
it's
it. You go for it.
I was
As
just
I
gonna
was
say it's
saying that I was
really
like, wait,
funny.
there's more plot that I didn't explain, which is like the original girl and the new soul are sort of fighting for control, and you
Yes,
get I think that's the most interesting part of the narrative is
I
like
agree.
Melanie,
The
the
internal.
past girl,
Yeah.
and the current soul are fighting between each other. And there was a movie of this, and the whole time I was reading the book, I was like, no, this cannot. Half the book takes place in complete darkness. Like,
I was
how
trying
can
to
this?
explain this. I was trying to explain this to my partner. I was like literally sitting there and I was like, you don't understand because he's seen the movie, but he's never read the book.
Mhm.
And he's like, I remember the movie being fine. And I was like, it is fine. It's not fine in relation to this story though. Like if you've read the book, you're gonna be disappointed by the way that this story is told on a screen. Right. It's just not made for it. It's really not made for it.
So yeah, what's your
funny,
story?
So obviously I picked it up around the Twilight craze, as the Twilight craze was like, because New Moon, I think, came out the same year as it. And I wasn't a Twilight girly. I like was really into like Vampire Diaries and like just a different like subset of vampire like saga novels at the time. And so like picking up Twilight never really vibed with me. I was like, I don't know. I don't know if I really love the story about old vampire man seducing young vampire, or not vampire girl. So I never really, like, I picked up Twilight, I think once, read through like a couple chapters, never got sucked in, and then never really like kept up with it. But I had a bunch of friends who were big Twilight, big Stephenie Meyer, just advocates. And my best friend at the time, she, I guess, had picked up the Host in waiting for just like getting ready for the next book. And she was like, Jess, I know that you aren't a fan of Twilight. I think you should try this book. And I was probably like, if it was 2008, that's like 9th grade, 8th grade for me. And so I was like, okay, but it's listed as an adult novel, which is kind of fascinating to me that like Stephenie Meyer was like, this one is my adult novel. But there's like less, to my understanding anyway, because like I said, I haven't read all the Twilight books, but like there's less like sex, like, or even like blatant like touchy-feely romance or anything like that in this book. Like it's there, but it's in such small amounts because it's not the main focus of the book. So I'm always shocked when I remember that it's like considered an adult novel and not YA.
Yeah.
Because it reads like a YA novel. Like everybody 100%. Is like, oh, it's her adult novel. I'm like, maybe older YA, maybe. And I think it gets that from being so philosophical, because that's the only thing I can like assume. And maybe being long, obviously, like it is a long book, but so are the Twilight books.
Yes.
So like, I'm like, I don't know how much that plays into it, you know, but I remember picking it up. Like I said, it was probably 9th grade. That sounds right. And I remember being like, okay, sure, I'll try it. I'll see. I'll give it a go. And I remember being so intrigued by the story elements, specifically, like you said. I mean, the strength of this book really is between Melanie, our main character, who's the Host, and Wanderer / Wanda, depending on what part of the book you're at, for the parasite that lives inside of her. And their unlikely friendship is really like the most beautiful part of the book. And like them both reconciling with the fact that like they both are monsters is also really fascinating to me, because early on in the book we get a lot of that, like the rhetoric about humans from like Wanda / Wanderer's standpoint, of just being like, you guys owned people, you guys like were killing each other, and like she's like, we don't do that, like we saved you. And like the viewpoint for a lot of they call them the souls, you know, the parasites, they call them souls. So for the souls, they really do believe that what they're doing is good, and like what they're doing is helpful and bettering this like species and the society. And it's only when Wanda has to confront Melanie still being there, which, side note, we know that Wanda's been in a lot of Hosts in the past. So like this is the first time she's struggled with a Host. And their dynamic really blooms out of like Melanie teaching Wanda that the things about being human that are like worth being human for are the exact things that they are taking away. Sorry, I have dogs trying to play. But yeah, so I think there's something really, really cool about that dynamic. And even rereading it, I found that to be the most compelling part of the book this time around too, is just them reconciling with what each of them are and how they aren't perfect. Neither one of these species is perfect. And Wanda really has to come to terms with that through the lens of like believing that they have been perfect her entire existence of like thousands upon thousands of years. And the fact that like we see, I mean, really it's a story about love, which I think I just really like. And I find that like love triangle / square, I keep saying that, I guess I should clarify that. Yeah. Melanie is in love with Jared, who is still human.
They were together before Melanie got. And
then Wanda, so the soul inside of her body, starts to fall in love with Ian, who is this character that we meet a little later on when we get to the human like base. And they fall in love. And so it creates this really interesting like heart versus body, but in a different way, you know, like, because usually when people are like, oh, sometimes, you know, your heart fights with your body, people are talking about it from a like internal, it's still all them standpoint. But for this novel, it really focuses on like, what do you do if like your body is in love with this man and only can think about, want, desire, be with, all the memories are attached to this man. But you, as the thing in the brain piloting that body, start to fall in love with a man that your body rejects. Like, what happens? Right. And like, that's a really fascinating part that we go over. It's a little messy. I think the romance aspect of this book, for as beautiful as some portions of it are, does, I don't want to say lose the plot sometimes, but it definitely like goes off the rails at points where you're like, right. What? Wait, yes. What?
It is sort of like straddling genres and age groups because that feels so typical. I think like of her work and like of 2008. Yeah. But it's really interesting because I forgot, or I don't even know if I knew that this was classified as her adult novel.
Yeah.
Because I'm wondering how much of that is like marketing, how much of that is like,
right.
I know that I have Twilight, which is divisive. So if I say this is an adult novel, maybe that will sort of like you, like get people who have this like knee-jerk reaction towards me. But at the same time, Twilight reads horny. And I think that is because sex is like taboo, off limits. And in here, there's an attitude, like we never really see sex. There's like some kissing scenes. But I think in here, it's this attitude of like, well, they're going to go fuck. We all know that. Okay, on with it. And I think it's that like casual attitude. It's the attitude of it that is like the huge difference rather than like the actual content.
I mean, I think that's a great point because, like, the first time we see Jared and Melanie meeting, which isn't a memory, but still, the first time we see them meeting, Jared realizes she's human and instinctually just kisses her.
Oh my god!
And she knees him in the groin and runs away.
Classic, like, yes.
Because they both think that the other is already assimilated, which is such a fun moment. But also, and then the Jared chasing her down and being like, look at me, I'm sorry.
Yeah, because the only way you can tell if someone is assimilated is like looking in their eye and seeing a little glint.
Yeah, if you see any of like that reflective, silvery, iridescent color, then they're infected. But it's so funny because that moment, like, is like, you would, I guess, call that horny, right? Like, that's why he does it, is because he's like, I haven't seen a woman in years. Like, I didn't know that people were alive. Like, but also, simultaneously, we get scenes like, Melanie, you're 17 and I'm 26. We can't. Like, that's not what we're doing. We have time. We're going to pump the brakes. And I think that the way that sex is kind of handled in this novel is through the lens of time. Like, it's like, we have time for that. That will eventually come. That's not the big part of survival and life and making sure that we remain people, right? Like, that's
the attitude is so opposite in Twilight. Yeah, the attitude is like, get me fucked now. Yeah.
Like, I'm horny, I'm ravenous, I really need somebody to like be on top of me. And I mean, in both parts of Twilight, I remember like thinking about the fact that I was like, wait, but if he can read her mind, then like, does he know how horny she is for him? You know?
No, because he can't read her mind, but she smells amazing.
Yeah, that's where it all goes. Why can't I read her mind? She's so fascinating.
She's so different.
Yeah, but like in this book, I feel like the way that they handle sex, one, I think they are aware of the fact that the age gap is problematic. Despite the fact that they never really address how problematic, like Jared points it out. He's like, you're too young for me. I can't do that. And she's like, but you want to. And he's like, yeah, I do, but I can't. And I'm like,
yeah, I think there's a moment where they're like, it's the end of the world. Age doesn't really matter anymore.
Like, on one hand, yeah, that would be the like reality, right? Is like, if you believe this is the last human woman in the world, I don't think you care that she's like, I mean, and again, she's 17. She's not like, you know, a child, but she's still, you know, underage. And I think that the book does a pretty good job, but also an awkward job of being like, we're not gonna have them fuck because that would be wrong. Wiggles finger in your face, but also they want to. I think I would be less weirded out about it because, like, obviously we do have a time jump between like memories that Melanie's having with Jared, you know, when they meet back up with the humans later. And so, like you said, our main character by the time of the book is 21, I think, which makes Jared like almost 29, I think.
I think 30, yeah. It's
30,
9 years.
It's 29 or 30. Yeah. And so again, the gap is still pretty relevant.
Yeah.
But again, there's this weird element of like, but we are so in love and we have been in love for this many years, and all I've thought about for all of those years is you. And so like that's what I guess I mean by like there's definitely like plot points in the romance aspect that it's like, I don't know why you decided to make that choice necessarily. Like, I don't think it really benefits the novel for Melanie to be younger. That's
because there were moments where I was like, Jared, you're 30 and you're behaving this way. Yeah, that's the only times that I remembered it. Yeah.
Yes. That's I think the problem that I had this time around, which I don't remember having when, you know, I was so much younger. But I constantly was like, if she has all these skills, why didn't they just make her like 2 years or 3 years older? Like there was no reason to make her underage.
Especially if it's supposed to be adult.
Yeah. Like it's like, why for your adult novel is your main character's oldest 21? That's kind of interesting. And it's an interesting choice. Yeah. And not to like skip forward and spoil anything, but like the ending even, I won't fully spoil, but like the ending choice with like teenage body.
Oh.
I was like, what? I mean, okay, yes, we have obviously established that like putting souls into adult humans is bad.
Yeah, like mechanically it doesn't work as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Putting them into like already brain dead bodies. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's do that. Did she have to also be underage?
There were such bizarre lines to the point where like I'm not sure what actually happened, because there was a lot of in the final pages of Wanda being like, I'm glad I lied about the age of this body. And I'm like, what does that mean?
What does that mean?
What does that mean?
Like what? And what's weird too is again, Wanda is established as being the oldest of all of them. She has lived so many lives, period. And then like to be like, yes, and now I'm teenage. Like, why?
Right.
Why? And I really thought, because there's a part where when we get to the humans, right, that Wanda / Melanie end up running into like this room that has like all these dead bodies in it, you know? And she finds out that it's from them trying to cut out parasites from people who had been infected and seeing if they can get them to come back. And every single time it results in them accidentally killing both the parasite and the host. And so one of the big plot points is Wanda deciding to teach them how to properly do that. I don't know how she would know because she's never been a doctor in her world, which we know definitively. So I'm like, do all souls just have that knowledge?
Yeah.
Common.
The way they explained it in the story is like, well, I had to do it once in like a life or death situation on a different planet. But it doesn't solve like, well, how do you know that? Like, is it...
Right.
Exactly, yeah.
Like, yeah, okay. But how did you get that knowledge in the first place to know to do that? Like, that's like, again, I think it's interesting because there's a couple plot points in the book like that where I'm like, that's kind of a convoluted plot point to make some big drama. But I still found myself enjoying it as like a casual read. And what's funny is what actually brought the host back around to my like psyche is I was scrolling through my social media and I was on Threads and I saw a thread that was like, can we now admit that Stephenie Meyer's The Host is a really good book? And I was like, yeah, wait a second. And I like went into the comments and all the comments were like people like, oh my gosh, I forgot about that book. Yeah, it was so good. Yeah. Why did she never continue with it? And so I was like, is it what I remember it to be? Or is it not what I remember it to be? And I found that like about 50% I remembered very vividly and very clearly. And 50% I was like, wow, my brain really did go, that's not important. I just moved on with enjoying the book.
What were some of those moments that you sort of glazed over that surprised you coming back to it?
Definitely the age stuff. Definitely all of their ages constantly. I was like, wait, why are you
Well,
acting
huh?
like that? Like, why are you talking like that? And then obviously there was a couple of things where I was just like, oh, right, they do kind of go over how every part of society works while also like excusing all of the evil. And I didn't really remember how much of that there was, like both
Right.
sides being like, let me justify the evil that I do. I was like, wow, I don't think I put together how much of the book is Wanda being like, you guys are evil, and Melanie being like, no, you guys are evil. Because I really only remembered like more fitting and big story beats that the two go through. I remembered the Seeker really vividly, which I thought was interesting. Her character always stuck with me. And so when she came back, I was like, yep, remember her.
Yes. And the Seeker is sort of our antagonist, kind of. She's like tasked with keeping track of Melanie.
Her goals are basically to get to Melanie's memories so she can get to the rebellion. And Melanie is making that very difficult for Wanda to access those memories. We get in the early parts of the book, we get a lot of Wanda internally. And this is why I was like, no wonder it doesn't work for a movie. Like, how do you show Wanda internally wandering around her brain, following like a thick wall that doesn't let her like see memories? Like, it's like, how do you show that in a movie without making it like campy almost? You know, like you'd have to do some very specific things, and that grows your budget to do anything in like the
my god, yeah.
And again, I think what's funny is more recently I've seen the movie, and so I remember when I first saw the movie being so upset, so disappointed, so upset, being like, they changed so much, they really gutted this book. But also recognizing like, how do you focus on a book that is not really about war when all you can show is the war? Like, because that's what the movie ends up doing. Is it's like, here's an action scene, here's more violence, here's another action scene, here's a romance scene, here's an action scene. But without all of that internal dialogue about why the war is stupid and terrible is gone, then you just have like, have you seen the movie?
No, go for it.
She whispers to herself out loud.
Oh
no! To show them like them having it's so bad. I was like, do it like End of the Fucking World, you know, like have them like, or any of the things where you can hear the character's internal dialogue. I was like, just give me that. Just give me that. No, she whispers to herself. She's like hiding.
Oh, that's really bad.
Like, no.
That's so hard.
And so it's funny because like I had so much more memory of there being a lot more violence in the book. I think because of the movie. And then which is ironic because so much of the book is about violence without actually really seeing it. It's about the violence that occurred, not the violence happening.
Yeah. It's sort of the philosophy of violence and being it's much more as a concept than as an active.
And so after finishing it, I like went and did like just a little digging to be like, I'm curious like where this came from. And I found out that Stephenie Meyer wrote it because of her feeling about body image issues and how we should just be happy to have a body and what it's like to have a body. And when I read that, I was like, wow, the book makes so much more sense. Like, a lot of the like really serious elements, and this is the criticism I've heard the book get, a lot of the really serious elements probably like Stephenie Meyer just isn't the right author to be tackling them. Like, she's not the philosophical author that really will give you all of those, you know, bells and whistles that make it all come together seamlessly and be a nice allegory. And I think that that's really just a matter of like, was she the right person to tell this story? I don't know. But knowing that it's a story about just loving being human and loving that you have all these senses, and then recognizing that the main crux of the story is Wanda falling in love with being human and all of those senses and being like, how do you ever go back from experiencing color and touch and emotion, which is a regular thing we hear at the beginning of the book too, is like her being like, I'm not used to bodies being this emotional, like, and having emotional responses to things. She's like, I've never been frustrated before. I've never wanted to fight with someone before. And she's like, but this body wants to fight. And so I think that like, knowing that like Melanie's whole character is the I will fight to hang on to my body because having a body is worth it. And Wanda's whole journey is coming to terms with why loving your body is worth it. I'm like, okay, that's very clear messaging, right? Like that makes sense from a story to story beat standpoint. Does it necessarily make sense from this is a rebellion fighting aliens at the end of the world scenario? Much less.
It's an interesting idea about body image that I don't think comes across.
Right.
However, I think it makes, I don't think she made the connection, but I think this book appealing to like teens makes so much sense because like what time other than puberty do you feel that frustration between your physical body and your mind not being synced? That's constant. That's getting your period in class, and that's your voice breaking and
and that's I think why, again, while I was reading it, because I think I remember when I was younger being like, oh, okay, her adult novel, how cool, how fun. Because again, I was like reading Stephen King, so I was into like the idea of more adult content at that point. And rereading it, I was like, this is just a YA novel with different branding. But again, I think that comes from the fact that you're right. It has so much of this feeling of puberty. And like, again, by choosing to make Melanie 17 to 21, and I know that's post-puberty, like, okay, but like still, like, I remember being like, before I got to 21, I never thought I was going to get to 21, right? Like everything was so turbulent. Everything was so confusing. I was like, how does anybody get past this? This is awful. Right. And so like, even then I'm like, you're still kind of working through like, who am I? What am I? Until you become an adult. And I think that maybe that's the point of making her 21 is like, now she's an adult and now she's doing this. But it, like you said, it falls flat because the connection's never fully made in the book that way. And so instead you end up with a story that is like a good time, but doesn't necessarily say too much.
Yeah, especially because I kept noticing that Melanie has a younger brother that is a huge part of the book and the biggest sort of like emotional tie for Melanie. But which because it feels so much like a YA novel, there is she doesn't dive into it fully, but there's a lot of discussion of motherhood.
Yes.
That I don't think she doesn't come to a full-fledged idea about it, but it's there so much. Yeah.
It's also, I mean, it's even brought up to Wanda that her body is capable of motherhood. And she's like, okay. Like, there is very clearly this like weird thing about motherhood going on in the book. What's weird to me is I put together, not the first time I read it, but this time that I read it, her age difference between herself and Jamie is an identical age difference between me and my brother. And he's my younger brother too. So I'm like, oh, okay, that's me. That's me. And Jamie is Jack. Okay, got it. Yeah. And then I was reading it and I was like, even if my mom died, even if I don't know that I would be like cradling his head on my lap at 10 years old, like running my hands through his hair. And maybe, but again, that is such a parental thing. And they never really explain how, like, they say that her parents were changed and all of that. And we get a little bit about her dad returning and showing them where they lived, but we don't really get a very concise, like, they were this old when that happened. And so, like, I'm like, okay, she's 17, he's 10, and then we jump forward and he's like 14 and she is 21. And every time we see them interact, I'm like, once again, you should have just made her a little older. And like, I understand and maybe that's why they didn't, is because of her brother being so young. But I was like, at that point, you really should have just made it like her cousin or like her niece or like, you know, like, you know what I mean? Like, you could have still made it about family and still made it about protecting Jamie at all costs because he's your last family member without forcing that to be the reason that you skewed everything down in age. But again, I also go back to, if you're going to skew everybody down in age, why did you leave Jared so old? Like,
because he doesn't act in yeah.
I know you're trying to make a point that men are, you know, men or whatever. And like, but it sometimes he reads like I don't want to say he reads like Twilight, because he's never like truly angsty enough for Twilight. But sometimes he says shit and I'm like, what book am I reading? Like, how
Yes.
old is this man? Never like teen angst, but there is this like underlying, like he's kind of a bumbling like golden retriever boy. Like wants
Or
to
like
do
he
well.
was and now he's like upset. Yeah,
Hard.
there's a lot that like it seems like he cannot control himself, which is
Yeah.
concerning for a 30-year-old. Yeah.
Yes. Especially a 30-year-old man who's having relations with a woman who's so much younger than him. And like when you
Yes.
regularly are brought back around to like them having these disagreements, it's like, okay, why does it kind of sound like you're trying to like father her? Aren't you trying to like sleep with her? Like, what do you? It's funny because I found myself loving Jared so much, even this time around, while I was first reading like the opening chapters and like going through their memories,
Mhm.
even though I was like, little weird that you're like doing this with a 17-year-old, but I get it. It's the end of the world. You're a sweetheart. You're doing all the right things. You're trying to do right by her. The scene where she like offers that they sleep in the same bed and he's like, you don't have to do that. I was like, oh, that's like
Yeah, that was
a
nice.
really great moment to like show that this man isn't only saving her to have sex with her, like that's not the
Yeah.
end goal. He actually does just want her to survive. But simultaneously, it's like, okay, wow, I love him. I love him. And then we meet him again. And I was like, wow, you're kind of a flat character and like kind of a jerk. And like 90% of, like, I know you still care about Melanie. I know you're trying to like navigate this weirdness. I know you're the reason she didn't die, but also like, bruh,
There's
why
a
are you acting
lot
like
of
that?
pouting.
Why are you
Yeah,
why are you
there's
like going around the caves like like
stomping. Yeah.
but what's weird is like they write Jamie like he's older than him sometimes. That's something I thought
Yes.
was fascinating. Is like Jamie has a lot of like really philosophical things that he says once you get back to him. And I'm like, that boy's 14. He's 14. He's 14 right now.
Yeah.
Like
I wonder if that's like Jared
fitting
got to have
it.
a childhood and Jamie
Sure.
doesn't. But I don't attribute that to Stephenie Meyer doing it on
Right.
purpose.
Again, like I think she got to the point of Jamie should be more adult because he's been living through apocalyptic hellscape. Yeah, that I think
Right.
that was probably a true thought. I don't think she thought about it in relation to Jared. And you can
Mm.
tell that because there's again not really a lot of moments that put that into perspective of like, this is what I'm saying. And so I feel like to your point, if anything, that was like a happy accident that you can get away with saying that, like, as opposed to like something she thought through. Because one thing that bothered me is that Jared changes character between when we meet him in the
Yes.
memories and when we meet him at the end. And I'm like, okay, there's like changing character because you've been traumatized and you think you've lost your girl and all of that. Okay. But you want me to believe that this man who like Melanie regularly is like, he never stops smiling. It's all he does. He always has a good attitude. He always finds the silver lining in things. And I'm like, and you want me to believe that all of that went away over a girl he knew for like a few months? Because that's what it boils down to, right? Is like maybe a year,
Mhm.
I think, that they were together before she goes off on her mission and is caught. And so it's like, okay, so he was that way through all of the invasion, watching all of his family die.
Yeah.
He met this girl and now he's a dick
Yeah.
because she got taken. And I'm like, okay, but you must have also assumed that that was a like you've already seen it happen to everyone in your life. And maybe that's what's trying to be said is like this was the last person in his life, but that's not true either because his whole goal was protecting Jamie. So I'm like,
Mhm.
so you what
Yeah.
happened here? Like there's not a lot of clarity in like how did we get from this golden retriever happy-go-lucky man to someone who pouts for the rest of the novel until like I don't know the back like
Until he gets
20%.
kissed. Yeah.
And like again, I do love the conflict of her being a part of the human colony. I love like that navigation of like at first she's like chained away and they like only certain people will talk to her, and then slowly but surely like she starts to get trusted more. And then like she's almost murdered and she still saves the guy. And so then everybody's like, ah, yeah, you probably are a good dude. And I'm like, okay, but also, if you want me to believe that you guys are the last remaining humans, at least to your belief, we find out that that's not true, that there are other groups of humans, and that there are even others like Wanda. But your group does not know that at the point in the novel that we are talking about. Why would you risk it? And you want me to believe that Jared and Jamie are the people who have enough control to tell every other human that they're living with, well, we're gonna risk it. Like, that seems crazy.
Yeah.
And it's moments like that where I'm like, wow, I love this part of the book because it is super fascinating and it is super dynamic. And there's a lot of really cool scenes of like philosophical conversation between people during the caves. But simultaneously, I have to suspend a lot of disbelief to believe that they didn't kill her on sight or leave her to die. That's the weird part too, is like, I understand Jeb being like, Melanie, that's my niece, but also be like, you knew she was infected and decided to take her back to all those people. That's bad. That's really bad.
Yeah. Jeb is her uncle who is in control of the whole colony sort of
He's
thing.
Like a survivalist expert.
Yeah. Crazy Jeb the prepper suddenly is the most prepared when the end comes. But, and so I think it's like, I think the reasoning given is that like, it is his niece, and he always says like, this is my house, my rules. But that relationship doesn't exist beforehand in our knowledge to justify, like, if Jared had run the whole thing, if Jamie had run the whole thing, if there was, more to that, if we believed in that relationship more. But yeah, it doesn't, and we're not given enough to know about Jeb that like maybe he is. I guess looking back now in hindsight, probably Jeb was like, maybe we can experiment and we're trying to get other people back. But yeah, it's like, I'm having to go through those stretches now here after reading it.
Well, it goes back to the whole, like, would Jeb have really, if he's known that all of their experiments have failed, that he would take his niece and be like, yeah, I want to cut her open? What do you mean? Like, I agree with you that I was like, if Jared ran it, it would actually make a whole lot of sense, right? And it also would make sense that he changed character so much. It would, all of these things would make so much more sense if they would have been like, Jeb used to run it, but Jeb passed away and Jared took over, and now we're here. Like, I would have bought it in a different way, I think. But like you said, we don't really get a lot about it. Like, the little bits about Jeb that we get prior to meeting him actually in the caves is that he came over to their house one day, was a panicked person, was like, they're going to do bad things to us. And then he sketches vigorously this like map, but we find out that it's not a map, it's a mountain from like a vantage point. And so it's all these lines that make up a mountainside. And it's like, okay, so that's what we get. Like, we don't even get like he was my favorite uncle. We used to always do these things together. And then my family started to kind of distance themselves when he became a prep. We don't get any of that.
None of it.
We don't get any indication that they were any closer than that was my crazy Uncle Jeb. And I'm like, I have a really hard time believing that like crazy Uncle Jeb, the doomsday prepper, who is the most prepared for this alien like species, was already paranoid about them before anybody else knew about them. You want me to believe he's letting one run around just because it's his niece? And again, I understand what we're supposed to see, is them growing to trust her and all of these things that quote unquote prove that Melanie is still in there. But throughout the rest of the book, prior to all of this, we're told that a bunch of the souls take on personality traits of the host. It's just kind of like a part of it. Like, usually it's not a lot. It's like minor, like, oh, I might now fall in love with this other person that I wasn't in love with because my body is in love with them. Or like, oh, I might like this thing more or that thing more. I might keep the human's name. Like, there's a bunch of like levels to like how much the souls end up integrating with their hosts and like holding on to pieces of that host. And obviously there's a point at which it becomes problematic, which is what we're told Wanda is, right? Where like Wanda and Melanie are in a problematic standpoint. But even the ones that aren't problematic, we're told like, yeah, all the time they take on traits of their host. And so that also makes me go, okay, so either you want us to believe that the humans don't know that, or nothing that she could ever do would prove that she's actually still in there.
Yeah.
Which is it? You know, like if they don't know that they take on traits of the host, okay, sure. But we've been told that so much as the audience. This is a thing. This is a thing. This is a thing. Sometimes it's not bad. Sometimes it just happens. And I'm like, so if humans have any bit of that knowledge, slash, all of those humans have watched as people pretended to be those people. They used those people's memories to pretend to be them for years. We hear that from the Comforter when she's like, oh yeah, well, you know, we were here for the invasion, so we pretended to be those people for like years. And like, okay. So once again, I'm coming back to the question, how does Melanie ever prove she's inside of her?
Like, exactly. It's sort of, they just kind of take her word for it, because there isn't, like, I was expecting, because I think I've seen it in other movies and stuff, I was expecting there to be like, oh, only Melanie would say that, only Melanie would know that. But yeah, within sort of the book that we get, but also the world that she creates, there is no definitive solution.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And in doing that, you now are forcing your audience to go, okay, I will suspend my disbelief that they didn't just kill her.
Right.
Because if I was in that scenario, I think we would just kill her. Like, she's been gone for that many years, and you also know that she has a parasite inside of her. Like, how do we ever know? And again, wonderful that we end up with the story that allows her to live, and then we get these moments that allow us to go, oh, okay, now that she's helping them remove parasites, I guess maybe. But even then, I'm like, okay, but that is quite literally trusting a parasite. Huh? Like, I get it that, like, that's what moves the story forward. I understand why Stephenie Meyer decided to just keep going, because trying to explain all that probably would take even more pages in an already bloated novel. However, I do think it would have benefited from at least a little bit of tidbits about, like, is it really just these three people who are like, yeah, no, she's living, and then everyone else is like ready to murder her at any given point? Why don't we have more murder attempts then? Like, why don't we? Because we get one. We get one. We get one attempt at being like, I don't trust you and I'm gonna kill you. It's used as like the big thing to prove that Melanie's still in there. And I'm like, right. But if I was a parasite and someone tried to murder me, and I was trying to coexist with all these humans, I also would save the human to be like, see, I'm not evil.
Exactly. It's a good strategy. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I found interesting, and I'm curious if you felt this way, I feel like the front half of the novel where Melanie is like blocking things from Wanda kind of goes fast. Like, we get really slow for the first like 10 chapters, and then they get to like the desert. And Melanie is just like, here you go. We could do this. Let's go here. We should do this. And it's like, are you sure you want to trust her? Because literally in the car, she was still thinking about skipping, which skipping is the soul being taken out of their current host and put into a more compatible host. And there's like some kind
before the host like dies naturally.
Yeah. They just get rid of the host entirely, and they're like, okay, you are going to be put into a better host that isn't
we'll try again,
is the word that they use. And I think that like that's such a fascinating part of the writing, is she does a really good job in those first few chapters being like, Melanie will not let you see this. This is not like, she is doing everything in her power. She's using all of her energy to like protect this memory. And then like we have this scene where Wanda's actually considering skipping out on Melanie's body and her being killed, or potentially having the seeker put inside of her so that she can look for memories or whatever. And they like have like this sad moment back and forth where it's like, oh, so you're considering killing me? And she's like, yeah. And then they're like, okay. And then she shows her some like memories of her and Jared in the past and her and Jamie in the past. And we're first told, hey, this is happening because she's like going through all of her happiest memories and she's just like trying to relive everything before she dies. But then we're immediately like flipped. And it's like, actually, she was showing Wanda all of those things so that Wanda would feel, and then she will help her. But that's not what we're told initially. And so then like we transition into like, all right, now we're in the desert and it's like, here you go. And this information and this information, we should go here. And like, we're still told that she's like giving it to her in like quote unquote small amounts, but it doesn't feel small anymore. Like, it's like you literally were just having a conversation where she's like, my job is to report you guys to the Seekers. That is my purpose. And now you're like, or your purpose could be different and you could go save Jared and Jamie, and you trust this soul to do that? Like, I don't know. Like, there's like a weird, very sudden shift. And I'm like, I wish there was a moment here that made me understand why Melanie would ever bother to trust Wanderer.
Yeah.
Because at this point in the book, she doesn't have a reason to do that. And we've already been told that she would much rather die than lead anyone to them. So why is now the threat of death why she's like, we could go here instead? Why would you lead her to them? That's the point of the book that I found myself like actually fighting with the most, is I was like, wait, why didn't their friendship bond here? At least a little, to give me enough context for why you would trust her. Like, because even the scene that you mentioned, right, where they go into the convenience store and get a bunch of groceries and water to walk into the desert, and like they're like, oh, you don't have to pay, blah, blah, blah. But even in that moment, Wanda's freaking out and is like acting like she's about to steal something. And she's like, I am about to steal something. But then they walk up to the counter and there is no stealing in this world. So I'm like, what was that sentence supposed to mean? Like what are you trying to say here? But it's like that moment in particular, I found myself constantly like referring back to in my brain and being like, yeah, but why did you bring her here? Like, why did you? Also, weren't you afraid that you were gonna get killed? Was that the plan, to be killed by the human? And I could maybe understand that, but that's not how it's framed, right? It's never framed like Melanie planned to get shot by humans, and that way the Seeker couldn't go into her body or something. You know, like, I would buy that. I would buy if Melanie was like, I'm gonna bring her to the people and they'll probably just kill me, but at least I won't be assimilated with a new soul. Sure.
Right.
But I wanted there to be a conversation between them later on when they were actually friends, with like Melanie explaining why she ever even showed any of it to her in the first place. And she doesn't, because at that point they're just friends and we're supposed to be like, yeah, we're friends. But they weren't at the point in the book where she tells her the secrets. So I feel like for as much of this book that it does well, there are plenty of points where it's like, I think you could have deleted this whole chapter and it wouldn't have changed the book. Like, I think you could have just like, I see what you were trying to do. You didn't succeed. Like, no offense to Stephenie Meyer, just like, you didn't add to what you thought you were adding to. You probably could have, like, this one could have gotten put on the cutting room floor. And what's funny is in the book that I just got for it, it's like new bonus chapter inside. And I was like, why? It starts with a note on the bonus chapter. While I was working with the producers for the film version of The Host, I started to think about some of the other perspectives that might make their way onto the screen when the story can no longer be in perfect first person. There was one moment in particular that had always existed in my head, though it couldn't appear in the novel because my narrator was unconscious at the time. I decided to write it down just in case the director was interested in showing that scene. Chronologically wise, this scene falls between chapters 58 and 59 of The Host. I hope you'll enjoy this new perspective on the story. And to give perspective on 58 and 59, that is the like final chapters of the book. And so the thing that she wrote down is all about, like, there's a moment in the novel where Wanda is extracted from Melanie. And the chapter in question is about Melanie waking up without Wanda present. So it's from Melanie's point of view, which is why I guess it wasn't put into the novel, because the full novel is from Wanda's point of view primarily. And so reading it, it's like all about Melanie's anger about the fact that Jared took her best friend away from her at this point. She's like, I'm a monster. Like, I killed my best friend so that I could live. Is that like the happy ending? Like, there's like literally a line in it all about, could that really be the happy ending I wanted? I killed my best friend, which is so fascinating to get to that point when you've had so much of the novel of them hating each other. But I read it and I was like, oh, that's a pretty decent chapter, like, but it was funny because I was like, again, I don't think it does anything more for the novel. It's fun, definitely fun imagery, like she punches Jared a few times and he's like, what the fuck is going on? But like, I went back after I read it and I reread the 2 chapters that it sits between. I was like, yeah, no, it just kind of like muddles up what the story is doing. And I understand that obviously she wrote it years later in relation to the movie. But the fact that she was like, it's always been a scene in my head. And I was like, I feel like a couple of the scenes that made it into the book are that, where it's something that like she never really killed her darlings with this book, it feels like, where it's like, I probably should have edited it down a little bit more and killed the things that didn't matter, but mattered to me, as the writer. But for all that it does wrong, the stuff that it does right, I think it does really well at doing right. It's one of those books where, unlike the other 2 things that we've covered together, right? Like Despero, I would left, right, and sideways be like, oh my gosh, so many fucking things that it has to say. And it's 100 something pages,
yeah.
like nothing. And like the fact that I had something to say about every chapter of The Tale of Desperos. And then this happens and this happens. And for this book, I'm like, there are like probably 20 really important chapters, and then like 20 chapters where you're like, oh, thanks for that information, I guess.
Right.
Like, and so it ends up feeling long-winded. Like it definitely does suffer from that. Like there were times where I was sitting down to read it, and I'll just totally admit this on your pod. I was supposed to record this with you 3 days ago. And I was like, I'm going to be totally honest. I put the date in wrong and I'm not done with the book. And it's because so often I found myself needing to put it down. And not because of anything graphic, not because it wasn't good. It was just like, wow, that was a lot of reading. And it's never written poorly. It's always like, the chapters are well written and beautiful and fun. The problem constantly loops back to, I don't know if I needed any of this. Like, I don't know if it needs me know more or feel more about this novel. But like I said, the things it does well, I think it does really well. Like it does at numerous points make you go, wow, humans do kind of suck. But also so much of the things that suck about humans also make them human.
Yeah.
Like the unfortunate reality of like, yeah, we are all emotional bags of meat, but that's part of being human. Like,
yeah,
we do all argue and have different opinions, but that's part of being human. And it's like, obviously, the book is from a very different time and a very different lens of literature. But I do think that in trying to be like, there is beauty in being human, the book succeeds. I don't know if the book succeeds at what it means to be human. I don't know if the book succeeds at, wow, isn't it just lovely to have a body, which was obviously her goal. But I do think it succeeds at the very least being like, there is worth in being the person that has all of these confusing, not clean, not totally perfect emotional states or reactions or whatever. That's just kind of part of being human. And so like, again, I don't know that like it's everyone's cup of tea, but I think that if you want a different story about like love and like family, and also just a different lens to look through for that kind of story, it's definitely a fun read. Like it's never like not fun, but I don't know that it's a weighty read like it's trying to be. It's trying to say something. You can tell the whole time that you're reading the novel that it is desperately trying to tell you something, but it's using so many words and so many like different, like even the way that they use like the other planets in relation to ours that Wanda's been on. I'm like, I know you're trying to say something. I'm not sure what exactly it is. Like I'm understanding all the emotions you're trying to give me. I understand all of like the big sweeping motions of like, yeah, isn't it awful that you guys like one of the things here's the way that I always boil down the best parts of the story. Yeah, is that Wanda doesn't want to disappear. There's like a point in the book where the Seeker is like, she's gonna eat you alive, you're going to stop being you. and you're going to like lose all of your previous lives. And like she points out, she's like, when hosts start to reject their souls, there's only a 20% chance that they don't lose themselves. And that freaks Wanda out. It's the thing that makes her consider skipping. It's the thing that makes her consider killing Melanie. But that also then forces her to reconcile with the fact that that's exactly what they're doing to the humans. And that's also Melanie's goal, is to not totally fade away and become nothing. And that, I think, is the story, right? Like, that's the story that when she's focused on that, it does well. And it's saying what it wants to say, and it is clear, and it is like, these two things both don't want to disappear.
Yeah.
They're both
and it's really nice
for the
that
same thing.
Yeah, exactly. That two people in conflict are fighting for essentially the same thing. And I think one of the, like, something I have to give Stephenie Meyer a big to do for is that I think it's gutsy to have like the POV kind of be from the bad guy's perspective.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that that's one thing that like I always come back around to, is I'm like, if you like body snatcher horror, you probably have never read anything like it. So often in body snatcher horror, we get the rebellion's vantage point, and we do still get a little bit of that with Melanie, but it's so much lesser, and it's actually challenged. And like I said, the fact that they actually give you that perspective of the aliens and of the parasites and being like, okay, but they think they're doing the right thing. They think they don't think they're being evil. They don't think they're genociding humans. They don't think any of that. They think they're helping. And by being put into like that perspective, it really does allow us to be like, oh, interesting. Their world is like this. They want to do this. They like go through these matters to get here, but we don't get that information in a lot of body snatcher horror because we're just running away from them. And so I think that like the amount of times that like in this book that Wanda's like, well, if they found me, I would be able to explain it away and be fine. I just say that I, got lost and whatever. And they're all trusting, so it would be fine. Like, and it's like, that's fascinating. It is. It's a fascinating, standpoint to watch from. I don't think it's always utilized to its fullest extent. Like, I think it's utilized a lot more at the start of the novel. And then obviously I know we're supposed to be with the humans, and so she has less context. But also, I still feel like it kind of drops off how much it matters that we are from that perspective. But it is, I do think it is a very fun perspective to take things on from and look at things from. I also very much enjoy that they made her worldly, and like a teacher. I think it was like really cool that they talk about some of her previous worlds, but I also feel like some of those previous worlds should have already proven to Wanda what they were doing was wrong based on some of the stories that she tells. Like, she already says she won't go to Heat World with the fire flowers because like she's like, oh, like there is something cruel about the fact that they eat another sentient living being. We don't want to do that. We didn't know that that's what was happening when we conquered that planet, whatever. And that they're like working, quote unquote, on like finding an alternative so they don't have to eat the people. They even say in the book like that if you don't like humans, like they're now starting to assimilate dolphins, so you can like go be a dolphin if you want. And it's like, okay, I get it. But also like there's a point where she talks about the seaweeds, and I remember this so distinctly from the first time I read it. But it's funny because it gave me a different feeling this time around, which was so fascinating. But she talks about how she was a part of this culture of like sea creatures that are all attached to the ground. They're underwater. All of their leaves and stuff have like thousands of eyes on them. They're basically a hive mind. She's like, it was lovely, like it was great. And the seeker's like, yeah, well, they couldn't run away. It was so much easier to like conquer them than it was to conquer humans. And Wanda tells this story and she's like, well, actually, like the southern colony got wind of what was going on because they're a hive mind and basically all like curled up their leaves and chose to die instead of like being assimilated. And she was like, it was awful. It was so sad. It was terrible. I can't understand why they wouldn't want to whatever. But she says something like, because they couldn't run, the Seekers underestimated their ability to resist. And I was like, that's a great line. It really is.
Yeah.
Like the idea of like, because we thought they couldn't go anywhere, we thought they wouldn't be able to like push back on us. But it's a conversation between Wanda and the Seeker doesn't get it. She doesn't care. She's like, okay. And then we just kind of move on. And the first time I read it, I like remember like being young and being like, that's so cool. Oh my gosh. And then I read it this time and I was like, Wanda, why didn't you realize you guys are kind of dicks at that point? Like, yeah. you felt bad, you felt guilt, you realized that like the species that you were like, they want it, didn't. Mm-hmm. But it took you getting to Earth. And like they kind of make that make sense by being like, because humans are so emotional, she was able to feel those emotions for the first time. But it's weird because like the way that they talk about all these other worlds makes it seem like they have a bunch of emotional intelligence and a bunch of like. So again, small moments like that where I'm like, wow, you really were trying to say something. And you got so close. But like in who's having this conversation, you also like kind of become the Seeker and you're like, okay. Instead of like if that would have been a conversation between her and Melanie internally, or like her and Jared, you know, later on, or her and Ian later on, where it's like a human could also then point out to her like, so you did realize that what you were doing was cruel, and like make Wanda go, oh shit, maybe it was. Because again, she doesn't have a word for it until now. So it's like, that would have been cool. Her being like, oh wait, I didn't realize that because we didn't have words for that. Like, I didn't know. But that never comes. That's never a thing. We're just supposed to understand that Wanda felt bad that happened to the seaweeds while she was a seaweed. And then she finished her life on that planet and she moved on to go assimilate someone else. And it's like, oh, okay. I get that it's trying to tell us that other planets have also fought back. I get that it's trying to say that, like, all life forms have a desire to keep their autonomy. I get what you're trying to say here. I also feel like in who you chose to have this conversation happen between, you botched your own mess. Like, you kicked yourself in the knee. Because again, I understand a lot of points in the book that kind of have that same thing happen, where it's like, I'm trying to tell you something. The other character is like, all right. And I'm like, so was that really just for us then? Like, it was really just for the audience. And I don't love moments like that where I'm like, you really wanted to say something philosophical to me, not to the Seeker, not to, like, you know, that wasn't a conversation that was actually happening between these two characters. That was a conversation happening between the book and me. And I don't like when I can clock moments like that. I like when I like leave a book and I'm like, oh, it was saying all of these things to me. That's so cool. And like I said, there are points in this book where that happens and you're like, wow, oh, that was cool. I liked that. But it is surrounded by a lot of bloated material that you have to like kind of sift through to find those moments.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that because it was very repetitive. I got bogged down in it a lot. And it also, so much of the novel takes place with her in the caves, in the colony. And she's weighed down by guilt so much and so much fear. And I've been realizing this through various things. I am so bored by narratives about guilt. I'm watching Boardwalk Empire right now, and one of the main female characters is so cool in the first season and then spends so many seasons feeling guilty about it. And that's it's a very passive thing to me. But I think in those sequences, in that big, I mean, it's like 2/3 of the novel that she's down there. She's talking so much about being an outcast and not belonging and trying to convince this group of people that she deserves to be there. And I just found a notebook from when I was in high school, and I was like, oh, half of this is still empty. I need a new notebook. We'll keep going through. And so I was looking through my diary entries from high school, which is treacherous, but there's so much about like, I don't fit in and I don't want to be here and I don't like this. And so that feels really relatable, where like guilt to me feels like an older, like a more adult kind of feeling.
And I feel like this book straddles that and then becomes like, yes, that becomes its like kind of problem, is like,
Yeah.
again, going back to if this was a teen novel about puberty, about not fitting in, about feeling
Mhm.
like your body does not belong to you, there would have been a very clear story. And I think that the guilt goes back to like I said, when I went and looked at what she was saying about like you should just love having a body. And I think
Right.
she felt guilt about not loving her body for whatever amount of time. But again, because those things aren't the point of the novel that she's
Yeah.
making, where they come out and how it comes out either ends up feeling whiny, repetitive, or just like so deeply like, okay, I understand that guilt, but like, what do I do with like, okay.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because guilt isn't as much of a driving force as something like anger or something like
Right.
sadness. There's something about guilt, like it's a disempowering emotion. And
Yeah.
I think there's a time and place to use guilt in novels because it's a disempowering emotion.
Hmm.
But when you want to have a strong female lead who constantly is at odds with herself, and the main like tool that you're utilizing for that is guilt, you end up with like, okay, but the first point of the novel was anger. There was so much
Right.
anger and resentment and internal fight. And as the novel loses that and starts to move towards guilt, understanding, and like friendship, you would think that like the friendship would take the front like end of
Yeah.
all of that, because again, that's a driving force. Okay, friendship, this is what's now moving the plot forward. But instead it really leans on that guilt hard. And it's like, I thought about that even when I was reading it, is like I was like, wow, no wonder 16-year-old me, angsty and angry, was like, yeah, relatable. And I was like, but that being said, ironically, I was what, a year off from Melanie's first age.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I should relate to her, I guess. I was really close to her age. And what's funny is now that I'm almost 30 and I'm reading it, I'm like trying to relate to Jared. And I'm like,
Yeah.
no,
No.
no. I'm curious how old Stephenie Meyer was when she wrote it. I should have looked that up
Yeah.
because it does feel like someone who wasn't 30 was writing those 30-year-olds, but I thought she was over 30 when she wrote this book.
Yeah.
So I don't
Let
know,
me
maybe she was
look.
dealing with some whiny men in her life,
Let's see.
stomping around her house or something.
She was 35.
Yeah, see, that's kind of crazy to me. That's kind of
Yeah.
crazy to me. And like, I think that would be my biggest criticism with this book, is that like Twilight reads like an adult wrote it for teenagers. It does. Like, you
Very.
know, there's at least enough moments in it where I'm like, yeah, an adult wrote this, but also teenage angst and teenage
Yes.
romance and teenage horniness, you know, is so at the forefront that it's like, yeah, okay, it's a teen novel. But this
Right.
book, I'm like, the fact that she said it was her adult novel and stuff too, I'm like, okay, like you said, is it marketing? Or is it that you
Mm.
felt closer to this novel as a 30-something-year-old?
Oh.
And so you assumed that it would lean towards adults, but really you
You,
still wrote it
yeah.
through a very similar angsty lens. Because, I mean, that's clearly her comfort zone, right? I mean, even on
Right.
the book, it's like author of the Twilight Saga. And it's like, okay, but you wouldn't put that if you
You don't
didn't
want to
want
advertise
overlap in
that.
your audience. Yeah, like if you didn't want the teens who read your one book to read your next book. And I feel like most people picked up this book as teenagers. Like
Oh,
I
yeah.
haven't really met many people who even know this book if they didn't pick it up as a teenager. Or they know the movie and that's all they know about it. But again, like I think that if you were to cut out maybe like 400 pages, make it half this size. And it's, I love a good long novel. Like that's not me
Yeah.
not wanting to read a good long novel. But you're right, so much of it is repetitive because
Yeah.
she's rehashing the same emotions and the same thoughts. And again, I do think the one spot that this book struggles is that Melanie's memories are the memories that we have.
Yeah.
Wanda's memories are all from different planets. So we don't really cover those nearly as much. We mostly are covering like
Yeah.
what happened with Melanie. But Melanie actually isn't our main character. She's our, you know,
No.
secondary lead. So we don't actually gain a lot from Wanda except for what is directly happening in that
Right.
moment. And because in that moment she's feeling guilty, there's nowhere for it to like go and like take us back and be like, but when she was little, these were the things she would have done. Oh, it's reminding her of this time when you can't really do that because she didn't live on Earth. She doesn't have a childhood. That I think also creates this like, it's hard to tell a puberty story if you can't reach childlike wonder, you know, if you can't actually reconcile with like growing up. She doesn't grow up. I mean, she's grown up, I guess, question mark, but like
kind of, yeah.
But like over the course of thousands of years. So it's like at that point, it's like, okay, that's a different understanding of what even a life is, which is kind of in the novel, like her trying to reconcile with like, oh, their life is precious and blah blah blah. I mean, at one point she even says to the seeker, like, the seeker's like, they fought so hard for this, that, and the other, and Melanie's like, well, wouldn't you? And that's pretty early in the book, and I'm like, I feel like that is not, that part doesn't say like those were Melanie's words, but I'm like, okay, so you do recognize what you're doing is kind of bad. And I don't know if the novel is trying to say that like Wanderer / Wanda was also always different, but they don't do a good job. Like that's not well established if that's true, you know, like
it's sort of like tangentially mentioned that like not a lot of souls go to this many planets, but it's very, very blinking you'll miss it. Yeah.
And again, like it's clear like she wants to go see the world, but also like that also goes back to, okay, so she's a colonizer and she really likes colonizing. Like
I really wanted Stephenie Meyer to like really take on colonialism, and I knew she wouldn't. Like that's not her job. I want this book in someone else's hands, a stronger author, because it's such a fascinating moral conundrum to me that they are parasites. They have to inhabit someone else in order to survive.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. But maybe mentioned twice. Yeah.
And that's what I mean by I'm like, do I think she was the right author to tackle any of these subjects? No. And even in the way that she talks about this book herself, it's clear she wasn't ready to tackle half the subjects in this book.
Right.
But again, the moments that are about the thing that she actually knows what she's talking about, great part of the book.
Yeah.
Very much enjoy the sisterhood that like grows between Wanda and Melanie, and how like her brain and her body learn to love each other. I'm like, that's cool. I get it. I get that that's the thing that you were trying to say. And again, there are certain elements of the romance in there that are fun and are compelling and are like, you know, never steamy really, but like are like, yeah, okay, that's cute. But like, but so much of it really is like, okay, I could have used more of that or less of this. Like one or the other. Like you could have cut out more of this and given me more of this, or just cut it out entirely. I don't really, don't really care which. But I do think you're right that in like a stronger author, or just, you know, an author that has more to say about colonialism or genocide or the big scary topics that she does allude to in this book.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't know that you can allude to like colonizing and genocide that casually, Stephenie Meyer. I think you need to like have a chapter or two that really focuses on like constructing that at least. But again, I think that like if you wanted to like experience a fun book and you didn't mind sifting through some really lengthy explanations for things you don't need lengthy explanations for, or tangents that you didn't need. I'm curious if like she was like, well, it can't be shorter than Twilight. Like, what? Why is it this big?
Is that just her? I don't know that she's ever published a short novel.
Like, is that what it was? She was like, I can't call it an adult novel and let it be shorter than Twilight. Like, why is it so big?
Did she have like a very permissive editor? Is it something with that publishing house? I don't know, but
that's also an interesting point too. I'm curious how much her editor was like cutting this down initially. I'm curious how long it was at first, or if it just wasn't cut down very much.
Yeah. Would you consider it required reading?
The funny thing is most things that I like have done with you on this show, actually both things I've done on this show, I immediately was like, yes. And this is the first one where I'm like, I don't think so. I don't think it's like a required book in your life at all.
Yeah.
The things that it tries to say, it says decently. The things that it tries to say that it doesn't know how to say, it does very poorly. But again, if you like body snatcher horror, I think you will actually enjoy this book. If you want a very unique perspective on body snatching horror, this is like a great book to go pick up. If you want a really interesting story about brain and body and falling in love with two people, also a great book to go pick up and read. But I think that, like, generally speaking, there are stronger books that, if you're not looking for those elements, there are stronger books that say things better. But like, it is a very unique book in what it does as a body snatcher. Like you said, the fact that it is from the parasite's point of view, the fact that it is all first person, so we do get a lot of insight into that parasite's thoughts and feelings and way that they navigate it. I think, like you said, it really depends on if you can get through the bloated parts of this book that kind of are redundant.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I enjoyed rereading it. I don't know that I have any desire to reread it in the next few years. You know, like, I think it's definitely one of those books where, like, nostalgia glasses, I was like, yeah. Less nostalgia glasses, I was like, it does a lot of things kind of poorly. But
maybe wait another 15 years and then come back to it again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A few years later. Yeah. But I think that if you are interested in that kind of story, this story's for you. If you are interested in the colonizing or the genocide or the war or any of that, this book is just going to bore you. It's just going to bore you.
You should maybe do nonfiction. There's a lot of good nonfiction out there.
Go read some really good authors that can tell you about real life situations. If you liked Twilight, I would recommend The Host. I think that's where, like, I kind of land. Like, if you liked the Twilight series and you wanted more of Stephenie Meyer writing, go pick up The Host. Go, like, you probably at the very least will enjoy it just because it's Stephenie Meyer writing, and it is really good when it's good. And there are points where you're going to be like, meh. But I feel like that also kind of comes through with Twilight. So if you can accept that about this writing, go pick it up. It's not a bad book. I never want to make it sound like it's a bad book. It definitely had its purpose in my life when I was 16. But I don't think that it necessarily is going to be everyone's cup of tea. And I don't think it's something that everyone needs on their shelf.
Definitely. Yeah.
But I loved it. I loved coming back to it. I loved having a different perspective 15 years later to be like, wow, all of these things I was reading as a kid, some of them just went over my head. Other of them I thought were much more philosophical at the time than they actually are. But the things that I mostly remember about this book that stuck with me are the things that when I reread it this time, I was like, yeah, no wonder. Like, those are the well-written parts of this book. It's chunky. It's bloated. But if you really are into any of those things, go pick it up. It's like $15. You know, it's not crazy. But if you aren't interested in sifting through a lot of unnecessary information or redundant information, no. Also, great maybe audiobook. You know, I don't know. I maybe an audiobook, but I think honestly you might find that it's enjoyable to listen to in the background more passively.
I wonder if they do like a different voice for Melanie. They would have to. I
would hope. Or at least if it's a voice actor, they change their voice enough that it sounds like a different person. I don't know. Like I said, I didn't listen to it. But I could see this being a great book for, like, if you had like a long car ride and you just wanted something kind of playing. It is interesting enough to like listen to. It is a long time to sit down and read. When you're like, didn't I just read this like 2 chapters ago? And you go check and basically
you did.
But again, the parts that are good are good. I don't think that Stephenie Meyer put out a bad book by any means by putting it out. I think she just put out a book that her messaging was misguided for. I think the things that she wanted to say get lost in all of the added elements that she made relevant to this book that would be more compelling than what she had to say. And so you're kind of left in this moment of like, I get it. I get what you're trying to say. I just want you to talk about all of this other stuff that you brought up. Can you tell me what any of this meant?
Right.
And I think a lot of it for her was scene setting, you know, like, oh yeah, it's been a genocide.
So
oh yeah,
much.
they colonized us. And that's kind of her just being like, this is me setting the scene for what it's like. But I wanted, especially because we're from the parasite standpoint, for her to really go into those parts more and like reconcile with the darker parts of this novel, especially if you're going to call it an adult novel. It's not an adult novel. We'll both tell you that right now. It's a young adult novel at best.
It is.
You could hand it to a teen and no one would be any different for it. Like I said, I'm pretty positive that there is way less implied sex in this book than there is. I mean, there's a scene in one of the Twilight books where they're soaking, you know, like, and it's like
basically, yeah,
like, he's still inside me while we talk, and it's like, yeah, that's way more graphic than this book. All that to say, no, unfortunately, I don't think it's required reading. But I think that for the right person who's interested in easy to digest text, even though it's bloated, it's all very simple. And interested in those, like I said, the body snatcher elements or the like really complicated romance elements. But that's really what this book has going for it. And that's where it ends.
Well, do you have anything you'd like to plug as we round out?
Let's see. This isn't mine, but you should continue to listen to Required Reading every time there's a required reading. And you should check out the Bookish Witch on YouTube. She puts out book reviews and book recommendations. So if you like this podcast, you'll also probably like that.
That's Madeline from our Princess Diary or Princess Bride episode.
My big recommendations.
Perfect.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jess. I'm actually recording the. Oh, my kitten was on my chest. She left. Thank you so much to Jess for this episode. It's a long one, which I think is good for Stephenie Meyer. You know, fitting. Next week, we are doing Crown Duel by Sherwood Smith with author Gretchen Schreiber. And I'll see you then. I just recorded it today. It's a really fun one. Read along. I'll see you then. Goodbye. Oh, and go to buymeacoffee.com/required reading to support the podcast, please.